Hi, dears. How are you? Today, we are going to discuss our next topic. How participants saw the moment. How participants saw the moment. In countryside, rich peasants like that, the Patidas of Gujarat and Jats of Uttar Pradesh, they were active participants in the civil disobedience movement. How participants saw the movement? How the participants saw the civil disobedience movement? So, in Gujarat, in countryside, rich peasants like Patidas of Gujarat and Jats of Uttar Pradesh, they were active participants in the civil disobedience movement. They were the producers of commercial crops. They were the producers of commercial crops. They were faced the hard trade depression and falling prices. So they were the producers of commercial crops. So they faced the hard trade depression and the falling price. So the Patidas of Gujarat and the Jats of Uttar Pradesh, they were active participants in the civil disobedience movement as commercial crop producers. They faced a hard trade depression and falling prices. So they participated in the movement as the producers of commercial crops. They faced a hard economic depression. As their cash income disappeared, they found it is impossible to pay government revenue demand. As the cash income, they were commercial crop producers. Their cash income, it was reduced, it was disappeared. So they found it was difficulty to pay the government revenue demand. And the refusal of government to reduce the revenue demand to widespread resentment. They demanded the government the reduction of revenue, but the government is not ready to accept their demand. It's led to widespread resentment or anger. They demanded the government reduction of revenue, but the government is not ready to accept their demand, so it's led to widespread anger. These rich peasants, they become enthusiastic supporters in the civil disobedience movement when Mahatma Gandhi started the civil disobedience movement. So these rich peasants, they were enthusiastic supporters of the civil disobedience movement. They were organizing their community. Rich peasants, they actively participated and they formed their own communities, and they forced the reluctant members to participate in the boycott programs. They forced the reluctant members. Some members, they were not, some business group, they were not ready to participate in the civil disobedience movement. So they forced the people or the members, those who are not participated in the boycott program. So they forced the people, those who are not participate in the civil disobedience movement. For them, the fight for Swaraj as a struggle against high revenue. So in the case of rich peasants, for them, Swaraj means the fight for high revenue. They were the producers of commercial crops. For them, Swaraj means the struggle against high revenue. But they were deeply disappointed when the movement was called off in 1931 without the revenue right was revised. They were disappointed. In 1931, civil disobedience movement, Mahatma Gandhi withdrew the civil disobedience movement without the revenue rights being reversed. They demanded the reduction before they were getting this result. Mahatma Gandhi withdrew the civil disobedience movement. So at that time they were disappointed. So when the movement restarted in 1932, many of them refused to participate. Mahatma Gandhi again in 1932 he started he restarted the civil disobedience movement. That time many of them, they were not ready to participate in it. So this is the case of rich peasantry business group. They were the commercial rich peasants, they were the commercial crops producers. Their economic depression affected them. Their cash income, it was disappeared, so they demanded the government reduction of revenue. Then they were active participants in the civil disobedience movement. When Mahatma Gandhi started civil disobedience movement, then without, there were reluctant members also. They forced the reluctant members to join this, but they were disappointed. Mahatma Gandhi withdrew the civil disobedience movement in 1931 without reversed their revenue. Then again 1932 Mahatma Gandhi restarted it. That time they were not ready to participate in it. Then the poor peasantry, the poor peasants, they were not just interested in the lowering of the revenue demand. Among the poor peasants, rich peasants, they demanded reduction of revenue, but poor peasants, their aim not only lowering the revenue demand. Many of them, they were small tenants cultivating land they had rented from the landlords. So many of the poor peasants, they were tenants. They were cultivating land they had rented from the landlords. They were tenants. They were working under landlords. They were rented land from the landlords, and they were cultivating in this land. So many of the small tenants, they were cultivating land rented from the landowners. As the depression continued and the cash income disappeared, their depression, economic depression, it was continued, and their cash income, it was decreased. So the small tenants, they found it difficult to pay their rent. Their cash income, it was completely disappeared. So they faced a difficulty to pay the rent. So they wanted unpaid rent to the landlords to be remitted. They were not ready to pay the rent because their production completely, a great economic depression completely affected them. So they were not ready to pay the rent. Then they joined in a variety of radical movement. They joined in a variety of radical movement, often led by socialist and communist. Rich peasants, they demanded reduction of revenue. Poor peasants, they were demanded unpaid rent because they were the producers. They were producing, they were taken land from the landowners. So the economic depression affected their life. Then they joined a lot of movements. It was led by the radicals and socialists. Radical movements, it was led by the socialists and communists. This might upset the rich peasants and landlords. So the rich peasants and landlords, they were upset when the poor peasants, they demanded unpaid rent, and they joined along with the socialist and communist. The Congress was unwilling to support no rent campaign in most places. In most places, Congress, they were not ready to support the unpaid rent, no rent campaign. They were not ready to support the no rent campaign in most of the places. Congress were not ready to support the unpaid rent in most of the places. So the relations between the poor peasants and Congress remain uncertain. Congress were not ready to support the small peasants and their demand no rent campaign. So the relation between Congress and poor peasants, it was uncertain. Next, what about the business class? During the First World War, Indian merchants and industrialists, they had made huge profit and become powerful. During the First World War, Indian industrialists and merchants, they had made huge profit and they become powerful. So during the First World War, Indian industrialists and merchants, they become powerful and they earn more profit. This already we discussed that Britain completely turned to war, so they needed more items. So they asked India to produce. Then we already discussed that disco. So during the First World War, 1912 they started, then 2 years there is no production. And then after that First World War started, Britain completely turned to war. That time they asked India to produce what they need. That time the production of Indian industries developed, it's boomed. So during the First World War, Indian industrialists and merchants, they become powerful and they become more powerful. Expanding their business, they reacted against the colonial policies that restricted their activities. So expanding their business, this business group, they want to expand their business. So they reacted against the colonial policy that restricted their activities. Colonial government, they imposed a lot of laws. It was affected their expansion of trade. So they reacted against the colonial policies that restricted their activities. They wanted protection against import of goods. Their demand, first demand, they wanted protection against import of goods, imports of goods, importing goods. They want to get protection. They wanted protection against the import of goods. And rupees sterling foreign exchange ratio that would discourage the import. So export to want to control. They want to protection against the imports of goods. And rupees sterling foreign exchange, their money and Indian currencies exchange rate, it was not in the same way. It's reduced the import. So they demanded, they needed protection against import of goods and rupees sterling foreign exchange, that ratio could discourage import. To organize business interest, they formed the Indian Industrial and Commercial Congress in 1920. So to organize their interest, they formed the Indian Industrial and Commercial Congress in 1920. So industrialists, to protect their demand, they formed Indian Industrial and Commercial Congress in 1920. Then the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industries, it was set up in 1927. Federation of the Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industries, FICCI, Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industries in 1927. To protect their interest, they formed their own groups, organization. Then led by the prominent industries lists like Purushottama Das, Thakur Das and G.D. Birla. Then it was led by the prominent industrialists like Purushottama Das, Thakur Das and G.D. Birla. Then the industrialists attacked colonial control over Indian economy and supported the civil disobedience movement when it was first started. So the industrialists, they attacked colonial control over Indian economy and they supported the civil disobedience movement when it was first launched. We discussed that first when it was first started, all the business group, they participated actively. Then when Mahatma Gandhi in 1931, he was withdraw the civil disobedience movement, so they went away from the Congress, or they were not ready to participate in the civil disobedience movement. Then they gave financial assistance and refused to buy or sell to the imported goods. They gave financial assistance and they refused, they are ready to give finance assistance to the civil disobedience movement, and they refused, they were not ready to buy or sell imported goods. And most businessmen came to see Swaraj as a time when colonial restriction on business no longer exists. Then the most businessmen, they came to see Swaraj was a time when all the restriction on business, it was removed, or it was no longer existed. Trade and industry would flourish without problems. Trade and industry would flourish without problems. But after the failure of the Round Table Conference, they were not satisfied. They participated, but after the failure of Round Table Conference, they were not satisfied. They feared that the spread of militant activities, and worried about prolonged disruption on business, as well as the growing influence of socialism among the younger members of the Congress. They feared that the spread of militant activities and worried about prolonged disruption of business, as well as the growing influence of socialism among the younger members of the Congress. That's why business group then they were not ready to participate in the civil disobedience movement in second time. So we discussed 3 points. First, how did the rich peasants they saw the civil disobedience movement? What Swaraj for them? And small peasantry, then business group. Rich peasants, they need lowering revenue. Poor peasants, unpaid rent. And business group, they want to remove all the restrictions on the business. So this topic, this area is over. Balance, we will continue the next class. This is a big topic. So we discussed the 3 points. I hope you understood this topic. Okay, thank you.